Some wounds don't show on the outside. They live in the heart. Fear that won't quiet down. Heartbreak that lingers. A heaviness you can't explain. Psalm 57 was written from that place. David isn't on a throne here. He's hiding in a cave, running for his life, overwhelmed and unsure. And yet, this psalm shows us something powerful. That being broken doesn't mean being abandoned. That pain doesn't cancel the purpose. And that God knows how to heal a wounded heart, slowly, honestly, and without letting go. 1. Broken, afraid, and hiding. David isn't writing this psalm from a place of comfort. He's hiding, alone, pressed in by fear. Psalm 57 opens not with confidence, but with a plea. David says, "Be merciful to me, O God, be merciful to me." He repeats it, not for poetry, but because pain has a way of doing that. When you're overwhelmed, you don't ask once, you ask again and again. Then he explains why. "For in you my soul takes refuge. In the shadow of your wings I will take refuge, till the storms of destruction pass by." Psalm 57:1 ESV. Notice what David doesn't say. He doesn't claim the storm is over. He doesn't say the danger is gone. He says he's choosing refuge until it passes. This is important. David is wounded, but he's not pretending to be strong. He doesn't numb the fear. He brings it directly to God. The image he uses is intimate. The shadow of your wings. Not a fortress, not a sword, something close, protective, personal. David is still afraid. Saul is still hunting him. The cave is still dark. But here's the shift. Fear no longer defines where David runs. Pain doesn't push him away from God. It pushes him toward him. This is where healing begins, not with answers, but with refuge. 2. A wounded heart. Still believes God has a purpose. David stays in the cave, but his prayer rises higher. He says, "I cry out to God Most High, to God who fulfills his purpose for me." Psalm 57:2 ESV. That line matters more than it seems. David's life looks paused. He's anointed king, yet running for his life. Promises spoken over him feel distant. Everything feels delayed. And still, he believes God has a purpose for him. Not just a plan, a purpose, something intentional, something unfinished. David doesn't say God might fulfill it. He says God will, even while hiding, even while hurting. This tells us something about wounded faith. You can feel broken and still believe God hasn't abandoned his work in you. David doesn't pretend he understands what's happening. He simply refuses to believe his pain is meaningless. Then he looks upward. He trusts that God sees what he cannot. This is quiet faith, not loud declarations, not forced optimism, just a steady belief that God is still writing, even when the page looks blank. David is afraid. David is tired. David is emotionally worn down, but he hasn't surrendered his future to fear. Sometimes healing doesn't come by escaping the cave. Sometimes it comes by believing God still knows why you're in it. 3. Trusting God while surrounded by threats. David knows the danger hasn't passed. He doesn't minimize it. He names it. He says, "He will send from heaven and save me. He will put to shame him who tramples on me." Psalm 57:3 ESV. That's not arrogance, it's trust. Then David anchors himself in who God is. God will send out his steadfast love and his faithfulness. Those words matter. Steadfast love, faithfulness, not temporary help, not shallow comfort. But then David gets honest about how this feels. "My soul is in the midst of lions. I lie down amid fiery beasts." Psalm 57:4 ESV. This isn't exaggeration. It's emotional truth. David isn't just threatened physically. He's surrounded by people whose words cut deeply. He says their teeth are spears and arrows, their tongues sharp swords. Pain isn't only what's happening to him. It's what's being said about him. Lies, accusations, betrayal. And still, David lies down, not because the danger is gone, but because he trusts God more than the threats. This is where faith matures, not when enemies disappear, but when trust grows stronger than fear. David is wounded, but his heart is learning where to rest. 4. Choosing worship in the middle of fear. Right in the middle of danger, David does something unexpected. He lifts his eyes. He says, "Be exalted, O God, above the heavens. Let your glory be over all the earth." Psalm 57:5 ESV. Nothing around David has changed. Saul is still searching. The cave is still hiding him. The threat is still real. But David shifts his focus anyway. This is not denial, it's alignment. David isn't pretending the fear is gone. He's choosing to place God higher than it, higher than Saul, higher than the cave, higher than his own racing thoughts. Worship here is not a feeling, it's a decision. David doesn't say, "When this is over, I'll praise you." He praises God in the middle of it, while unresolved, while unsafe. That matters for anyone walking through emotional pain. Worship doesn't erase fear, but it does reframe it. It reminds the heart that danger is temporary, while God's glory is not. David's prayer expands outward, from a cave to the heavens, from his situation to the whole earth. Fear narrows our vision. Worship widens it. This moment marks a shift. David is still wounded, still hunted, still unsure, but his heart is beginning to lift. And sometimes, healing starts the moment we stop staring at the walls and look up instead. Before we move into the next part of this psalm, take a second to like this video and subscribe to Stick to God. If this story is helping you slow down and see God differently, you'll want to stay with us for what comes next. 5. When the trap doesn't get the final word. David goes back to describing the danger, but now with clarity, not panic. He says, "They set a net for my steps. My soul was bowed down." Psalm 57:6 ESV. That line is honest. His soul wasn't strong. It was bowed down, pressed, heavy. Then he adds, "They dug a pit in my way." David knows people are actively trying to ruin him. This isn't imagined fear. It's targeted hostility, planned harm. But then comes the turn. They have fallen into it themselves. David doesn't explain how. He doesn't claim victory. He simply acknowledges something he's learning. Traps don't always work the way people expect. This doesn't mean David never feels afraid again. It means fear no longer controls the story. God doesn't always remove the trap. Sometimes he reverses it. David pauses here, Selah, a moment to stop, to breathe, to let the truth settle. For someone dealing with heartbreak or depression, this verse matters. Not every scheme succeeds. Not every lie wins. Not every attack defines the ending. David is still in danger, but his soul is no longer collapsing under it. Healing doesn't always look like escape. Sometimes it looks like realizing the trap didn't have the last word. 6. A heart becoming steady again. Something changes inside David here, not externally, internally. He says, "My heart is steadfast, O God, my heart is steadfast." Psalm 57:7 ESV. He says it twice, not for emphasis alone, but because he feels the shift happening. David doesn't say his fear is gone. He doesn't say the danger disappeared. He says his heart is becoming steady. That's important. Healing in Scripture often starts internally before circumstances change. David is still in the cave. Saul is still alive. The future is still uncertain, but David's inner world is stabilizing. A steadfast heart doesn't mean unbreakable. It means anchored, no longer tossed around by every threat or emotion. Then David responds with action. "I will sing and make melody." This isn't performance, it's overflow. Praise now flows from stability, not desperation. David isn't singing to escape fear. He's singing because fear no longer owns him. This is a quiet turning point. A wounded heart doesn't instantly become whole, but it becomes grounded. David is still broken, still chosen, still learning to trust. And here we see it clearly. God hasn't healed him by changing the situation yet, but he has begun healing his heart. 7. From silence to song. Something else changes in David here, not just his heart, but his voice. He says, "Awake, my glory. Awake, O harp and lyre. I will awake the dawn." Psalm 57:8 ESV. David speaks to himself first, before the music, before the song. He calls his own soul awake. This isn't spontaneous joy. It's intentional praise. Notice the timing. David doesn't wait for rescue. He doesn't wait for daylight. He says he will wake the dawn, not respond to it. Then his focus widens. I will give thanks to you, O Lord, among the peoples. I will sing praises to you among the nations. Psalm 57:9 ESV. This is bigger than the cave now, bigger than Saul, bigger than fear. David moves from private survival to public gratitude, from hiding to testimony. He's not just praising God to God, he's preparing to praise him before others. That matters for healing. Pain isolates. Worship reconnects. David is still wounded, still hunted, still unsure how this ends, but silence no longer controls him. His heart is steady. His voice returns. And sometimes that's how healing shows up. Not as answers, not as relief, but as the courage to sing again, even while the cave is still dark. Let's pause here for a moment. If you've ever experienced healing from God, emotionally, spiritually, or quietly over time, share it in the comments. Your story matters. Your insight could encourage someone who's still waiting for hope. This is a growing community, and your voice can help someone else keep going. 8. Love that reaches beyond the cave. David now reflects on something larger than his pain. He says, "For your steadfast love is great to the heavens, your faithfulness to the clouds." Psalm 57:10 ESV. This is perspective gained through suffering. David doesn't describe God's love as fragile or temporary. He describes it as vast, uncontainable, beyond what he can see from the cave. Steadfast love, faithfulness. These are covenant words, words that don't depend on circumstances, words that don't shrink when life gets hard. David's situation is still unresolved. Saul is still alive. The future is still uncertain. But God's love has not changed size. That matters for a wounded heart. When you're depressed or heartbroken, pain feels infinite. It fills your vision. David learns to measure his pain against something bigger, not his strength, not his plans, but God's character. God's love doesn't stop at the cave walls. It reaches the heavens. His faithfulness doesn't bend under pressure. David doesn't escape pain by ignoring it. He places it inside a larger truth. And this is how trust matures, not by pretending wounds aren't deep, but by realizing God's love is deeper still. 9. Broken, but still chosen. David ends the psalm where he turned earlier, but now with confidence. He says, "Be exalted, O God, above the heavens. Let your glory be over all the earth." Psalm 57:11 ESV. This isn't repetition out of fear, it's affirmation. David no longer speaks only from desperation. He speaks from trust that has been tested and held. Notice what David doesn't say. He doesn't mention Saul. He doesn't describe the cave. He doesn't ask for escape. He centers God. This is important. David is still broken, but he knows he is still chosen. Not because he is strong, not because he figured everything out, but because God is faithful. Healing here isn't dramatic, it's quiet, it's internal. David hasn't been rescued yet, but his heart has been restored enough to trust again. That's the message of this psalm. God doesn't wait for David to be whole before staying close. He meets him in fear. He steadies him in pain. He reminds him that brokenness does not cancel calling. David leaves the cave eventually, but before that, something deeper happens. A wounded heart learns to trust again. And that's how God heals, slowly, faithfully, without letting go. Psalm 57 doesn't end with David rescued. It ends with David steady, still hunted, still uncertain, but no longer collapsing under fear. That's the heart of this chapter. God doesn't always remove the cave right away, but he strengthens the heart inside it. David reminds us that healing isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's learning to trust again, to sing again, to believe again. Broken, but still chosen, and held by a God whose love reaches far beyond the cave.